Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 550, and today is February 28th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot of news on today's show and a lot on the war in Ukraine today. Some pretty important information has been released, so we will be breaking that down, and of course some more news on Gaza and the other wars going on in the Middle East. Be sure to share. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. I repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find the video version of the show at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee, and of course it's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. And you can always support the show by following me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_ and sharing out all the work I do. I write several articles, typically multiple articles a day, and then I publish this show, and all that ends up on my Twitter feed. All right, with that, let's get into the news, and this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. CIA built 12 spy bases in Ukraine near the Russian border over the past decade. The CIA helped build 12 secret spy bases in Ukraine along the Russian border as a part of the agency's support for Ukrainian intelligence that started in 2014, the New York Times reported on Sunday. The report described one of the CIA-built spy bases as an underground bunker used by Ukrainian soldiers to track Russian spy satellites and eavesdrop on conversations between Russian commanders. The report sheds new light on the CIA's involvement in Ukraine, which played a major role in provoking the Russian invasion. A European official told the paper that when Russian President Vladimir Putin was considering invading Ukraine towards the end of 2021, the head of Russia's main spy services told him that the CIA and Britain's MI6 were controlling Ukraine and turning it into a beachhead for operations against Moscow. The CIA agreed. Oh, excuse me, I lost my spot here. The report said the CIA's relationship with Ukrainian intelligence could be traced back to February 24, 2014, right after the Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych was ousted in a U.S.-backed coup. On that day, the new head of the Ukrainian Service of Ukraine, the SBU, the Ukrainian Intelligence Agency, and the CIA asked for help in rebuilding Ukraine's intelligence capabilities. The CIA agreed to help as it saw it as an opportunity to collect more intelligence on Russia. The U.S. spy agency helped from the 5th Directorate in the SBU, which consists of young Ukrainians who were born after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The idea was to Assange CIA concerns about Ukrainian spy agencies being full of older, more Russian-sympathetic Ukrainians. The Washington Post first reported on the CIA's creation of the 5th Directorate back in October 23, and we did cover that on the show. The Post also said that the CIA had spent tens of millions of dollars to transform Ukraine's Soviet-formed services into potential allies against Moscow, and we also have covered in the past on the show the reporting done in Yahoo News about the CIA ground branch and all the training the CIA was doing of Ukrainian soldiers from 2024 on through the Trump administration. I think that article, I want to say, came out in 2022. So, you know, we've had a good idea that this was going on, but really now we get to see the extent of this and how much, you know, again, if Russia or China had set up a bunch of, say, spy bases along the Mexican border, a dozen of them, the Americans would be absolutely livid. And of course, with everything else the U.S. was doing in Ukraine, pushing the country to join the NATO alliance, orchestrating coups in the country, all these other steps, of course, made, you know, this a real threat to Russia. So back to today's article here. The CIA has also supported Ukraine's military intelligence agency known as the GRU. The GRU provided an opportunity for the U.S. since it wasn't allowed to collect intelligence outside of Ukraine, meaning it could be used inside of Russia. A former U.S. intelligence official speaking to the Post described the GRU as our little baby. That was a quote. The Times report said that the CIA started training Ukrainian spies who have operated inside Russia, across Europe, in Cuba, and other places where the Russians have a large presence. The CIA also helped create an elite commando unit known as Unit 2245, which collected Russian drones and other technologies so the U.S. could reverse engineer them. One member of Unit 2245 is now head of the GRU. Ukrainian intelligence services began assassinating separatist leaders in the Donbass in 2016 and has credited with killing several people inside of Russia, including a car bombing that killed Daria Dugina, the daughter of a Russian philosopher. U.S. officials insisted that the CIA wasn't involved in the assassinations, but the killings have also not impacted the CIA's support. The CIA's and overall U.S. intelligence support has significantly increased since Russia launched its invasion in 2022. Most U.S. personnel were evacuated from Ukraine right before the invasion, but a group of CIA officers remained in a remote location in western Ukraine and provided intelligence support for the first weeks of the fighting. The head of the SBU, when Russia invaded, told the Times that without the CIA, there would have been no way for us to resist the Russians or to beat them. So, I'm not sure if maybe in some parts they give the CIA a little bit too much credit, like right at the end, but certainly the massive presence of CIA forces on the Russian border and all their activities was certainly probably part of the reason that Russia decided to go ahead with the invasion of Ukraine. All right, so a couple articles here on the potential of NATO troops going to Ukraine. We've seen a lot of reports on this on recent days, so I just kind of want to go over the two things that Dave DeCamp has broken down here at antiwar.com. First, NATO chief says no plans to send combat troops to Ukraine. So Secretary General of the Alliance Jens Stoltenberg said Tuesday that the alliance has no plans to send combat troops to Ukraine after French President Macron stirred an uproar by saying the idea of deploying troops should not be ruled out. So Stoltenberg told the AP, NATO allies are providing unprecedented support to Ukraine. We have done that since 2014 and stepped up after full-scale invasion. But there are no plans for NATO combat troops on the ground in Ukraine. In response to Macron's comments, the Kremlin said deployment of Western troops to Ukraine would make a direct NATO-Russia war inevitable. In this case, we need to talk about the probability about the inevitability of the conflict, said Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. For its part, Ukraine has celebrated the discussion of NATO troops being sent to Ukraine, despite the risk of nuclear war. This shows, firstly, an absolute awareness of the risk posed to Europe by a militaristic and aggressive Russia, said the Ukrainian presidential advisor. Some leaders of NATO countries distance themselves from the idea of sending troops to Ukraine. Poland does not plan to send troops to Ukraine, said Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Macron made the provocative statements on Monday after European leaders held a meeting he hosted in Paris to discuss Ukraine's proxy war. And so next I want to get into this article, also from Dave DeCamp. Slovakia says some NATO members are considering sending troops to Ukraine. Slovakia Prime Minister Robert Fico warned on Monday that some NATO and European Union countries are considering sending troops to Ukraine, a step that would risk direct war between NATO and Russia. Several NATO and EU member states are considering sending their soldiers to the Ukraine on a bilateral basis, Fico said, who was elected last year on a platform of opposing the proxy war with Ukraine. And we've covered this on the show too, that under his rule in Slovakia, the country has actually stopped sending arms to Ukraine. He said, we see huge security risks in bilateral agreements that are unlikely to be conducted soon with NATO and European Union states that want to send their troops to Ukraine. So he's worried about these agreements that are being made between various European countries with Ukraine. Germany and France recently signed them, and so that's why he's ruling out. And then, of course, we have the statements from Macron. All right, next up here, Ukraine in trouble. Ukraine will be short on ammo and struggle to hold off Russia for several months. So the Guardian reports, Ukraine is expected to remain short of ammunition and on the back foot in its war with Russia for several months until the West agrees to further steps to support Kiev, the head of British Armed Forces acknowledged. This is Admiral Sir Tony Radican, and he said Ukraine faced a difficult situation on land where its army was struggling in terms of ammunition and its stockpiles, with U.S. military aid halted by Republicans in Congress and Europe being unable to plug the gap. I think the predicament is likely to last for the next few months, Radican concluded. So that's a pretty bleak assessment for the Ukrainians. And of course, the West keeps saying we're going to do everything Ukraine needs for as long as it takes, but Ukraine has a major manpower shortage, so unless they're willing to send troops, the West may not be able to help Ukraine in the way it needs, especially when it doesn't have the ammo either and is losing territory. All right, next up here, this is a Pentagon Inspector General report looking at some of the decisions that the Biden White House made sending weapons to Ukraine. So Washington shipped weapons to Ukraine without long-term sustainment plans. When the Joe Biden administration transferred some of the most advanced American-made weapons to Ukraine, it did not have a long-term plan in place to ensure that Kiev could maintain the systems. A Pentagon Inspector General report said, without deliberate and planned sustainment support, including proper spare parts, ammunition, and maintenance support, the Ukrainians would not be capable of maintaining these weapon systems in their ongoing fight against Russia's full-scale invasion. Providing Patriot air defense systems for the UAF without strategy for sustainment increases risk both to the Department of Defense and Ukraine. Specifically, Ukraine may be unable to independently sustain the systems, and the DoD faces challenges supporting Patriot systems in Ukraine while still maintaining the readiness of U.S. Patriot air defense systems. The report explains that the Pentagon is now working on a plan, although it is unclear how the DoD would be able to spend more money sending parts or providing maintenance services without Congress passing additional aid for Kiev. The author of the report notes the lack of foresight in this matter is concerning and should be rectified promptly. According to Defense Post, apart from Patriots, the evaluations covered the delivery of Bradley, Stryker, and Abrams armored platforms to Ukraine as well. So seemingly all these weapons platforms would have the same problems. And so I think this is a real issue. We will see how this plays out, particularly if Congress doesn't pass more aid to Ukraine and there's no way for the White House to have the money, to provide these spare parts or maintenance. Now, when I say that, there are other end rounds and things that the U.S. government could do or maybe even is doing to bypass Congress and still ensure that Ukraine is operating, their Patriots and other American-made weapon systems. One of those is something I'm very concerned about. Yellen calls for frozen Russian central bank funds to be given to Ukraine. So Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on Tuesday called for the U.S. and its allies to hand $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank funds to Ukraine, a step that would significantly escalate Western economic war against Russia. Yellen said, "It is necessary and urgent for our coalition to find a way to unlock the value of these immobilized assets to support Ukraine's continued resistance and long-term reconstruction," she said, where a group of G20 finance ministers were meeting this week in Brazil, according to the AP. The comments from Yellen mark her most supportive statements for the outright theft of Russian funds to finance the war in Ukraine. The call comes as the Biden administration is struggling to get Congress to pass $60 billion it needs to fuel the conflict. I believe that there is a strong international law, economic, and moral case for moving forward. This would be a decisive response to Russia's unprecedented threat to global stability. The U.S. needs the support of European countries for the bulk of the Russians' funds. About $200 billion are held in European banks. The EU is still debating the idea, but has approved a law to set aside profits made by the Russian central bank funds to send to Ukraine. So I guess that would include like interest payments or things like that. About $67 billion of the Russian money is held by the U.S. Federal Reserve. U.S. officials have previously expressed concern that spending the Russian funds can make other countries hesitant to keep funds in the dollar, thus speeding up global de-dollarization. Yellen insisted that this was extremely unlikely that stealing Russian funds would hurt the dollar or the currencies of the U.S. allies. realistically, there are not other alternatives to the dollar, euro, and yen, she said. So the yen's the Japanese currency, where I think there's quite a bit of the Russian money held in Japan as well. Now, I don't think we should believe Yellen on this. We've seen time and time again throughout the war in Ukraine, that the Western economic actions against Russia have largely backfired, and not only have not had their intended consequences of harming the Russian economy, they have also harmed the American economy as well. All right, next up here, Ukraine military intelligence chief says Navalny died of blood clot. So remember, President Biden said that Putin killed him, and he knew this for sure. Well, the head of Ukraine's CIA-backed military intelligence agency said Sunday that the Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny died of a blood clot. I may disappoint you, but as far as we know, he indeed died as a result of a blood clot, and this has been more or less confirmed. This wasn't sourced from the internet, but unfortunately, natural causes. He says, unfortunately, natural causes. I guess he really wanted Putin to have killed Navalny. According to Navalny supporters, his death certificate issued by Russian authorities said that he died by natural causes. Now, look, he did die in a Russian prison, and he is a 47-year-old man. And so I would guess it's probably pretty rare for generally healthy 47-year-old men to die of blood clots in a way that, maybe it was the conditions in the prison, not being able to get enough exercise. Maybe, he had gotten beaten up once, or, I'm sure there's a lot of ways that blood clots can form as a result of being held in either dangerous or, just very poor conditions. So I'm not necessarily saying here that, had Navalny not been in prison, he would have either died or not died, or, would have been saved or not had the blood clot. I don't know for sure. It's hard to say. This isn't as clear cut to me as, say the case of Gonzo Lira dying of slowly dying of pneumonia in a Ukrainian prison, just because, a blood clot, the impact of it is going to be much more immediate, where with pneumonia you had to have it for, Lira had it for months and months before it actually took his life, and there was a lot of time between when it formed and when it killed him to actually treat him and to save his life, where with Navalny that may not have been the case. So maybe more information will come out of this. Maybe we'll get some timelines and things like that. My guess is that, this did happen in a Russian prison, so there's probably not a lot of Western knowledge about what goes on in there. And the only other thing I wanted to add is this is why I didn't I really don't think I spent any time on the show, but on Twitter or just on other appearances I really didn't give too much credence to the idea that the Western governments had Navalny killed, and this seems to suggest that definitely wasn't the case, that they would have been able to or did induce some kind of blood clot in him while he was in the penal colony to have him die. All right, next up here, let's get into some news on the war in Ukraine. First one is from myself and Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. Biden memo tying military aid to humanitarian law was to avert oversight of support for Israel. So this is a little bit confusing. I was having trouble writing a headline that really conveyed what was going on here, but the Joe Biden administration is requiring all countries that receive military aid from the U.S., including Israel, to agree not to commit war crimes using American gear. The White House crafted the pledge to prevent Congress from placing restrictions on a massive military aid package for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, as some lawmakers press for greater accountability for U.S. arms transfers. According to rights groups, Israeli forces have used American-made weapons to commit a number of suspected war crimes in Gaza. Earlier this month, President Biden issued a national security memorandum that said American military aid would be linked to compliance with international law. While the executive order was largely redundant, as the Leahy laws prohibit U.S. arms transfers to countries that ignore war crimes, Several American presidents have ignored Israel's routine violations of international law while lavishing Tel Aviv with billions in military aid. The document was intended to relieve mounting political pressure on the Biden over his unfettered support for the war, Israel's war in Gaza, which has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians over months of bombing. According to Senator Chris Van Hollen, the memo was issued after he and other Senate Democrats proposed an amendment requiring greater oversight for U.S. aid to Israel as a part of the $95 billion military spending bill currently stalled in Congress. He said, in a statement he gave to Axios, myself and the other co-sponsors of the amendment made it clear to the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer that we are determined to have a vote if we do not succeed in implementing it through executive action. That is the fact that it made sense on the merit of it, persuaded the administration that they should work with us on this. And so, not that I'm saying that it would have made a difference if this oversight would have been congressional, but we already know that for the Biden administration that they're not going to do anything about this. So keeping it in the executive is probably better from the perspective of the empire, the pro-Israel crowd, the pro-war crowd. Israeli and U.S. officials told Axios that the White House asked Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to sign a letter stating he would avoid committing war crimes using American weapons. The effort is likely to have little impact, however, as the White House has refused to leverage its ties with Israel to pressure compliance with basic humanitarian law. Netanyahu and other top Israeli officials have regularly flaunted Biden's requests through the war, including appeals for Tel Aviv to ease its grip on aid bound for Gaza. On Monday, a senior U.S. official acknowledged that aid shipments had dropped to just 85 trucks a day, while assistance in northern Gaza has all but ground to a halt. Despite Biden's calls for the creation of a Palestinian state as a part of any long-term solution to the conflict, moreover, the prime minister has repeatedly rejected the idea outright. Late last year, Amnesty International documented 2 Israeli bombings using U.S.-made joint direct attack munition. These are JDAM guidance kits, which killed at least 43 Palestinian non-combatants, including 19 children and 14 women. The humanitarian org identified the missile fragments from the ruins of the destroyed house and described the attacks as unlawful airstrikes on homes full of civilians. The U.S. made weapons facilitated the mass killings of extended families. Amnesty International Secretary General Agnes Callamand said at the end of October, said that the October air raids, adding that many of the strikes further proof that the Israeli military is responsible for the unlawful killings and injuring of civilians using American military hardware. So next up here, actually, let's do this one first. This one is from Dave DeCamp. Israel Hamas indicate Biden spoke too soon about potential hostage deal. And so this is what I suspected and have been writing at antiwar.com over the weekend and reported on the show on Monday, was the Biden hostage deal that was portrayed as progress and close, and even President Biden with a ice cream cone in his hand said that he expected it could be reached by Monday, March 4th. We now have both Hamas and Israel pouring cold water over all that. So President Biden on Monday said a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas was close and that he hoped a ceasefire could be reached by Monday, March 4th. But in response, both sides indicated that agreement is still far away and that the president spoke too soon. According to the Times of Israel, one Hamas official said the Biden comments were premature and didn't reflect the reality. Another Hamas official told Reuters that there were still big gaps between the two sides. Hamas is looking for a permanent ceasefire, while the deal that is reportedly on the table would be for a 6-week truce. The primary and main issues of the ceasefire and the withdrawal of Israeli forces are not clearly stated, which delays reaching an agreement, one Hamas official said, according to Reuters. According to the AP, Biden's comments came as a surprise to Israeli officials who were not done in coordination with the Israeli government. Israeli officials are blaming the attack, the lack of Israeli officials are blaming the lack of an agreement on the Hamas demands, although Haaretz reported Monday that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was also contemplating negotiations. Netanyahu has said that any hostage deal would only delay the Israeli plans to invade the southern Gaza city of Rafah, which borders Egypt and is packed with 1.5 million Palestinians. A full-scale assault would incur a huge civilian death toll, as most Palestinians are sheltering in tents or on the streets of Rafah. The deal that's on the table would involve Hamas releasing 40 Israeli hostages during the 6-week pause, as Israel releases hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Hamas has previously offered to release all Israeli hostages in exchange for the release of thousands of Palestinians and a 135-day ceasefire with the goal of reaching a permanent settlement, but that proposal was rejected by Israel. All right, next up here, another article that I wrote for the Institute. U.S. official admits only 85 aid trucks entering Gaza per day. The head of USAID said on Monday that only around 85 aid trucks were able to enter Gaza each day, around 15% of the pre-war number. The White House has touted that it has leveraged the U.S. influence it has over Israel to get Tel Aviv to provide more aid to the Strip. However, Tel Aviv is deploying a myriad of tactics to strangle aid shipments in Gaza. More than 500 trucks should be entering Gaza daily. In the past week, only around 85 managed to get through. Samantha Power, the head of USAID, posted on X. Power, who considers herself an expert on genocide prevention, has not called for a ceasefire or an end to U.S. weapons shipments to Israel, even as the International Court of Justice has concluded that Tel Aviv is plausibly waging a genocide in Gaza. Before October 7th, about 500 trucks enter Gaza daily to sustain the people. The number of Palestinians in the Strip needing aid has skyrocketed over the past 4 months. Nearly all 2.3 million Palestinians are displaced and do not have access to clean water or food, as well as a lot of other basic necessities. Since Israel went to war in Gaza, Tel Aviv has used a multitude of methods to stifle aid deliveries, including directly attacking aid shipments. CNN reports that an Israeli military attacked an UN aid shipment in Gaza on February 5th after approving the trucks to travel through the Strip. Additionally, Israel is preventing U.S.-funded food shipments from being unloaded at the port. Tel Aviv has enacted an onerous inspections regime that slows down and prevents life-saving medication from reaching the Strip. Israeli government agencies have also denied visas to international aid workers, limiting the activities of dozens of organizations. Israeli civilian protesters are also interfering with shipments by blocking and delaying trucks carrying the aid. Once convoys enter Gaza, they are mobbed by starving Palestinians. This is made worse because recently Israeli forces began targeting the police force in the Strip, making it harder for the trucks to move through Gaza. Previously, those police escorted the aid deliveries and helped maintain order, but that no longer now exists. The U.S. has asked Israel to stop doing it, and it doesn't seem that there has been any progress there. Should note that Jordan has airdropped some aid into Gaza 16 times now since October 7th, so that's less than once per week, to bypass the backup at the border and inspections checkpoint. The Israeli onslaught in Gaza has thrown the Palestinian people into a horrific humanitarian crisis. Most of the medical facilities have been destroyed or shut down, and tens of thousands of Palestinians have suffered serious burns, cuts, and amputations. In the northern half of the Strip, 1 in 6 children are suffering from severe acute malnutrition, meaning they could soon die of starvation or other deprivation. A 2-month-old child succumbed to starvation in central Gaza this week. Palestinians are eating animal feed, grass, and rotten food to survive. And I did read today that 2 more children in Gaza have starved to death. So it seems like, we're really going to, there's a very difficult line, and it's probably very gray and blurry where you go between rampant starvation to actual famine, where, people in a condition of famine are people who are actively dying of, preventable diseases like cholera, things that cause diarrhea, the flu, upper respiratory illnesses, in a combination with a lack of food and, or water, or other, basic necessities, that have been cut off. And so Gaza, it's probably, Gaza will probably be well into famine before the international community really recognizes that it is in famine, and all the groups are actually saying that, hey, the famine has set in, that, these young, 0 to 5 year old Palestinian children, the elderly Palestinians, are starting to die off due to deprivation that has been caused by the Israeli military activities and besiegement of the Gaza Strip. And so I mentioned here again, of course, that the Biden administration says, they're leveraging aid to Israel to get them to allow in more aid, but it's not having any impact. All right, next up here, this was interesting because I actually found this statement in Voice of America, which is American state, paid for state media. But this is: Israeli forces block medical evacuation in Gaza. Israeli forces in Gaza approved, then blocked, the medical evacuation of several Palestinians in Gaza, including a pregnant woman and a new mother. So this is a statement from the UN spokesperson Jens Lark, and they said on Tuesday that despite prior coordination for all staff members and vehicles with the Israeli side, the Israeli forces blocked the WHO-led convoy for many hours, and the movement the moment it left the hospital, we were forced to leave 31 non-critical patients behind. The 24 evacuated patients were transported from the Al-Amal Hospital in Rafah to the Al-Amal Hospital in Rafah, where they could receive treatment, and several, if not all of them, required some kind of surgical intervention, which of course was not able to happen. I think they were in Khan Sheikhoun and they were moved to Rafah. The Israeli military forced patients and staff out of ambulances, stripped all paramedics of their clothes. We have not had any information or communication from Israeli authorities as to why this clearly notified movement, which they, by the way, acknowledged that they had sent them the notification, was still detained for 7 hours. You can't imagine being already transferred under life-threatening circumstances, not able to move, or being able to move and being made to stand outside and having to wait for 7 hours is pretty unimaginable. Humanitarian workers have been harassed, intimidated, or detained by Israeli forces, and humanitarian infrastructure has been hit. Just prior to Sunday's incident, 2 members of Doctors Without Borders were killed in an unprompted attack by Israeli forces, a deconflicted compound where their staff and family members slept. So that's just awful. Israel has detained 3 paramedics. They released 1, but 2 are still being held. All right, this one from Dave DeCamp is pretty interesting. Egypt accused a threatening rights group that reported on construction a camp in Sinai for Palestinian refugees. So Israel has been accused of threatening a human rights group that's first reported the construction of a wall camp for Palestinian refugees in the Sinai Desert on the border with Gaza. 18 civil society groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, said Egyptian officials have been engaged in a smear campaign against the Sinai Foundation for Humanitarian Rights, SFHR, and its director. The SFHR was the first to report on the construction of the wall camp, and said to be built to prepare for the influx of Palestinian refugees as Israel is threatening to invade Rafah, the southernmost city in Gaza that's on the Egyptian border, impacted with 1.5 million Palestinians. Egypt has denied the report, but the Wall Street Journal also published a story on the construction and cited unnamed Egyptian officials who said the camp would be able to house 100,000 Palestinians, but Cairo would like to keep the number to 50,000. And I have brought this up, that this doesn't seem like a real displacement plan for the Palestinians, something that's happening in coordination with Israel. this sounds like maybe Egypt is preparing to have a lot of Palestinians that over time get medically evacuated. For example, if a young child undergoes an amputation, that child is probably going to have to undergo like a dozen or more surgeries over their lifetime as they grow to compensate their body for I don't know how to phrase it medically, but anyways, there's a lot that has to go on to maintain that amputation and ensure safety. A lot of people with serious burns and other very serious and horrific injuries that are going to need months, if not years, of near constant medical care that may not be available in Gaza. So I wonder if maybe Egypt is essentially thinking that we're going to have a rash of people, maybe these people and their children, their other dependents, elderly people, orphan children, who maybe have really nowhere to go in Gaza and kind of get pushed across the border. And rather than send them back, they're planning on holding them in this camp. But remember, there's 2.3 million Palestinians. So this is 5%, like a fraction of their population that could be supported in this camp. All right, a little bit of good news here. Poll: 2/3 of U.S. voters support U.S. pushing for permanent ceasefire in Gaza. A new poll from the Data for Progress has found that about 2/3 of American voters support the idea of the U.S. pushing for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, an idea that is opposed by the Biden administration. When asked if they support for the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and general de-escalation of violence, 67% said they did, including 77% of Democrats, 69% of independents, and 56% of Republicans. The support for a permanent ceasefire increased by 6 points since the Data for Progress asked the question in a poll that was conducted at the end of November. Throughout the conflict, polling has consistently shown that a majority of Americans, in both parties even, and independents, favor a ceasefire. In the latest poll, voters were then asked if they would support the U.S. calling for a ceasefire, de-escalation, and the release of Israeli hostages from Gaza, including the release of all hostages, and that support increased to 74%, which is pretty crazy because this is the Hamas plan, right? The majority of Americans support the Hamas plan to end the conflict. 74%, overwhelming majority, because it's sensical, right? Because Americans want to see this bloodshed end. They want this over. When presented with arguments from both sides on why or why not to support a permanent ceasefire, 50% said the U.S. should call for a ceasefire right now, while 35% said it should happen after Hamas is defeated, and 15% said they weren't sure. Hamas has been offering to release all remaining Israeli hostages in exchange for a permanent ceasefire, but that position has been rejected by Israel. In its latest proposal, Hamas suggested a 135-day ceasefire with the goal of reaching a lasting settlement in that time, but that was turned down by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has called Hamas's demands delusional. And it doesn't look like we really have any progress there now. All right, before we wrap up here, a couple stories on Lebanon, one on the war in Yemen. 2 killed, several wounded as Israel attacks Lebanon northern region for first time, not most northern, but the Bekaa Valley, which is more north than the southern border, which is mainly where Israel has been attacking. This one from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. For the first time since the beginning of the Gaza war in October, Israel fired against targets in the Bekaa Valley near the eastern city of Baalbek in Lebanon. At least 2 people were killed, reportedly Hezbollah members, but several others were wounded. Israeli comments on the matter suggest the targets were trots in the attack, while Hezbollah said that strikes hit a pair of buildings, one of them a warehouse belonging to a Hezbollah organization, and the other an empty 3-story building. The attack followed Hezbollah shooting down an Israeli drone over southern Lebanon earlier in the day. One of the missiles fired at the drone was reportedly intercepted, although Hezbollah ultimately brought down the Israeli UAV. According to Lebanese officials, the wounded in the Bekaa Valley attack include not just members of Hamas, but civilians and members of the Lebanese army. 2 of the casualties included a soldier and his 4-year-old child. The attack sparked a flurry of attacks between Israel and Hezbollah, with Hezbollah firing some 60 missiles across the border, which reportedly targeted a base in the occupied Golan Heights. There was no word on the damage done by the missile fire yet, although there are reports of single Israeli settler injured when missile fragments from an anti-tank missile resulted from the fire. All right, and then this one from Jason Ditz. Dave DeCamp here. Report: Hezbollah would fire on Israel if ceasefire reached in Hezbollah would halt fire on Israel if ceasefire reached in Gaza. So Hezbollah would halt fire on Israel if Hamas agrees to a hostage deal that includes a ceasefire, unless Israel continues to bomb southern Lebanon, Reuters reported on Tuesday. And the bad news here, of course, is that the Israelis have sent the opposite message, which is they believe that striking or a ceasefire in Gaza, ending the war in Gaza, will create a new opportunity for them to go to war with Hezbollah and attack Lebanon, not the other way around. And I do think that this has to happen. And this is a little bit of, having to understand what's going on in Israel. But there are a lot of Israelis who are displaced along the northern Israeli border. Many of those Israelis are living either outside of the country right now or in hotels in other parts of the country. A lot of this is being paid for by the Israeli government. And so, of course, having a massive amount of people displaced, maybe they can't work because their jobs are around where they live, having to pay for that, losing some of those people leaving the country. I think Israel feels that they need to push Hezbollah significantly back from the Israel-Lebanon border, or those people will not feel safe to return home. And of course, if they're not safe to return home, then that's a major setback for the Israeli project. All right, last article here today. Civilian reported killed in British-U.S. bombing of Yemen. So Yemen's Saba news agency said a civilian was killed in a series of missile strikes the U.S. and Britain launched across Houthi-controlled Yemen over the weekend, marking the first reported civilian death since the U.S. began bombing Yemen on January 12th. And it is interesting that this is the first reported civilian casualty from the U.S. and U.K. bombing of Yemen, given that they have now dropped hundreds of bombs on the country. I do wonder if possibly they're getting a little bit more aggressive in the areas that they're striking and when they're striking them, thinking that this will net more military gains, but of course, it could also kill civilians. And so very sad that this is happening. I wish the war in Yemen, now it's the U.S. war in Yemen, no longer the U.S. bad Saudi war in Yemen, would finally come to an end, but it doesn't seem like Washington has any intent to allow that to happen. All right, everybody, thank you for tuning into the show today. I'll be back with more later in the week.